Okay, Dad, today is Monday, April 22nd. And who did 9/11?
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist when it comes to 9/11. Hey, there's nothing wrong with conspiracy theories, or some of them. Some of them are true. Sometimes they're really conspiracies. Um, and then it's just funny what gets called a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy that the mainstream, or even not a conspiracy, anything that the establishment disapproves of, any interpretation of events that they disapprove of, is called a conspiracy theory. When they have clearly what is a conspiracy theory, like the whole RussiaGate hoax, which was a huge conspiracy theory, and this was proven to be utterly false.
Hmm.
That's never called a conspiracy theory, right? But yeah, there are all kinds of conspiracy theories floating around about 9/11. Say that it was, a false flag. That I happen not to believe that. I think it's what it was. Um,
Well, the internet has told me otherwise.
yeah, I'm sure it has. But anyway, that it was in fact, Al Qaeda, and it, was carried out by these 19 hijackers. Now, it seems clear that they had support from elements within the Saudi Arabian government. In fact, that was something that our government was aware of right at the start and tried to hide from public scrutiny. And eventually, I think the document was released that showed that that was indeed true. Um,
Why would the Saudi Arabians want to?
well, because actually, that's where Al Qaeda has long been supported from within Saudi Arabia. Because there are people, Sunni extremists within the Saudi royal family that actually support the ideology of Al Qaeda, and then also to Saudi Arabia, not unlike the United States, has used Al Qaeda and similar groups as a weapon against their enemies. They used to use them against Iran and Iranian proxies, the Syrian government. Um, so it's not surprising that there would be some elements in the Saudi government that were actually funding the plot or whatever. But
So
yeah,
when they say funding the plot, they're funding
yeah,
Osama bin Laden, funding
yeah,
Al Qaeda,
yeah, right, yeah, and maybe this particular operation, and they were aware of it.
even though the Saudi Arabians are our
Yeah,
ally, they're
right,
giving them tons of money.
right. That's the crazy thing is that what happens, of course, Saudi Arabia. It's not. I don't think that in fact, the king at that time was actually behind it or aware of it. I haven't seen any evidence to that effect, but there were, certain officials, certain members of the royal family that were. And I think that's pretty well demonstrated. Yeah, so if anything, we're going to attack a country afterwards, it should have been Saudi Arabia, right?
Right.
It wasn't the Taliban that was behind it. The Al Qaeda, Bin Laden was in Afghanistan at the time, but nobody's presented any evidence that the Taliban was aware of it. And in fact, there was already friction between Al Qaeda in Afghanistan and the Taliban government. And the Taliban apparently even offered to hand over Bin Laden to the U.S. But we just wanted to go in there and have an excuse for an invasion of the entire country.
Well, why would we want to invade Afghanistan?
Well, I think it's mostly just a kind of a show of force. It was like, hey, okay, man, uh, we got punched right between the eyes on this, and it looks bad, and we got to show that America's strong. You just got to lash out at somebody. It just
Even against if it's not against the people that were
Yeah,
responsible
well,
for it.
obviously, because Iraq wasn't either.
Yeah, right.
Iraq was that was just entirely bogus. You can make some kind of argument for Afghanistan, but it wasn't the Taliban government. It was this group that was on their territory, and maybe you can argue that, well, they were on the territory, so therefore they're somehow implicated. I don't think that really holds up to scrutiny, but you can make some kind of argument there, but not for Iraq. There was no connection between the Iraqi government and Al Qaeda.
So why did we do that? Was it because of the Israeli lobby?
I think that's what John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt argued very persuasively in the Israel lobby. It was pressures, from the Israel lobby. They long regarded Iraq as an enemy, and they just saw this as a chance to take them out. So there were a lot of people, with dual citizenship in the U.S. government. Wolfowitz, is probably the best known of them, who push really hard for this invasion of
What
Iraq.
was the justification?
Well, they try to construct this argument that, well, first of all, that there was some kind of connection. And they really couldn't come up with anything. But then the justification was weapons of mass destruction, which they never found.
Which we're kind of hearing the same thing with Iran, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, they've been doing that about Iran, I mean, for decades now.
Okay. So you're...
But I guess one thing you're talking about 9/11, get back to another conspiracy theory is like the Israelis are behind that. Now,
that's what I was going to get to.
Right, because I figured that's what we want to get to. So, but yeah, there is evidence that very strong evidence actually that they knew it was coming and failed to alert, the U.S. authorities. There's what were they call it? The dancing Israelis.
I was about to bring that up.
Right. That actually appeared incredibly, like on Fox News immediately afterwards. He said, what are these Israelis here dancing and whatever? And then Fox News, of course, took it down later and pretended it never happened. But it did happen. And, the video footage is there. And these guys, there were a number of Israelis, like some Saudi Arabians, that were kind of immediately shuttled out of the country afterwards.
Right. That's because what I saw her too.
Yeah. So it seems that the Israelis, they had an intelligence operation going here. They were following these guys. They knew what they was doing, but they thought this was great. That because they could see the benefits that they would derive from this. So they let it happen.
Yeah, the reason I brought up this question is I haven't really thought of 9/11 that much. I was a little kid when it happened in 6th grade. And and I never really thought there was a conspiracy around it. I never dove into it at all.
Right.
But after our last conversation, we were just talking about how much Israel has, how much influence they have over our government and our politicians, and learning about these events like the USS Liberty and Mossad assassinating, a Swedish prime minister.
Okay, I'll make a correction to that.
Okay.
I was thinking, I knew he was high level, but he was never prime minister. He was a Swedish nobleman, but very famous at the time, Folk Bernadette. And he was highly regarded, not just in Sweden, but around the world. He had, even before the end of World War II, he had negotiated the release of numbers of prisoners from concentration camps and so forth. And so he was highly regarded. When the UN wanted to appoint a mediator, to Palestine, he was a man, and he received unanimous approval. So you give you a sense of how highly regarded he was. And he was assassinated by a Jewish terrorist group.
Well, why? What was just?
Well, I think the fact is, it's like what we see here. I mean, that they quite often. This is the thing, we're seeing with horror what's happening here. Like very recently, the Israelis killed the 3 sons of the Hamas leader, and with a number of his grandchildren. Just this horrible thing. And it was clearly, he was, obviously, they're supposedly in negotiations, right, for the release of the hostages and for a ceasefire. And then you assassinate the sons and then the grandchildren of their leader. It clearly is an effort to upend, to prevent negotiations from going forward. And they had done that earlier in Lebanon. There was a chief negotiator, again, Hamas, I believe, that in southern Lebanon, that was assassinated. You're assassinating the negotiators. Well, because they actually don't want these peace agreements. They want to continue to war. They don't want to be put under pressure to come to some sort of terms. They think that they've got the military upper hand, and peace negotiations are just an impediment to their eventual victory. So this is something you can see. It's not. You can see it in concentrated form recently. First of all, the targeting of negotiators, but also the targeting of UN workers, UN officers. It's how many? 100, 200. UN personnel have been killed. It's at least that, recently. But yeah, it goes back. I mean, to Bernadette, I'm sure even earlier, but so he was, the UN mediator, and he was assassinated. And really, over the years, it's happened again and again. People that follow who followed this have seen this as a pattern.
And no other country does stuff like this, right? I
Not,
mean,
not
not to,
really. Yeah, it's just like they're in a class by themselves. Also just mentioned the fact that they had assassinated many people. I took a little deeper dive into that, and um, there was a book that came out in 2018, Rise and Kill First, which was researched. It was a result of 6 years of research by an Israeli-born journalist, and it received a lot of attention. A lot of intelligence officials, from different intelligence agencies, like the CIA, said, like, hands down, this is the best. This really tells you, and it catalogs an enormous number of assassinations by Israel, and even pre-Israel days, going back to the 1920s. These, Jewish Zionist groups have been doing this. And like when it was reviewed in the New York Times back in 2018, the reviewer said that, though this guy clearly hadn't listed all of the assassinations by a long shot, it was still clear that Israel was, like, by far, the had killed the most or conducted the most assassinations of any country in the world.
Mm. Right. Well, okay. So then if you look at just the history of Israel, they carry out these assassinations. They seem to have no qualms of killing civilians. They're obviously trying to have, on many occasions, try to provoke the other nations so that they can try to drag the United States into war. That's what we're seeing currently with Iran. Obviously, what happened with 9/11, they used that as an excuse to invade Iraq, which was a country that had nothing to do with 9/11 at all.
Right.
So judging just from that history, and everything you told me about Israel and learning how they have so much influence and control and money over our government, and then I'm seeing, and then I started going on the internet, and the internet's telling me, hey, 9/11 might have been done by the Israelis with these 5 dancing Jews. And then I started thinking, it's in their MO. It's not beneath them to kill a bunch of people, to frame somebody else, to use proxies, to create some disaster, to further their own gain, and to get the United States riled up to do something like beat up a country.
Right.
Which is what they did.
Right.
Like, maybe even if we say they didn't do 9/11, it was clear that they took advantage of the situation.
Right. They let it happen.
Right. And so why are you so sure that it was just the Saudis? How are you so sure that it's not Israel that was using some proxies and using their money and influence within the Saudi government, within, like you're saying, the MEK or...
Yeah, right. Well, you're right. You can't say that it couldn't happen. I just have not seen any evidence of that.
All right, I'll tell you what the internet's told me.
Okay.
This is what I learned this morning on the toilet. So I'm not the best, and I was just going down this rabbit hole, and I'm like, what is going on? But so yeah, I heard about the 5 dancing Israelis. From my understanding,
that's real. There's no question about it.
That they were parked in New Jersey parking lot with watching it from afar, and taking pictures of when it was happening and celebrating. And there's photos of them high-fiving. One with like a lighter, one it hit, underneath it to show it like exploding. Clearly reveling in the fact, and they stopped. They were there earlier.
Right.
2 of them,
they knew it was happening. It was going to happen.
Right. They knew it was going to happen. 2 out of those 5 were directly linked to Mossad, just from documents from what I saw, just from the FBI. And like you said, it's not like this was hidden. It was on Fox News. These dancing Israelis, who were these guys? They were working under some Israeli moving company that seems to be a front for Mossad.
Right. Yeah.
And so that doesn't seem to be that disputed. So
I've heard all that, and I think that's.
And then there was this messaging app. I was just talking to my buddy GPT about Odigo. Have you heard of Odigo? So it's an Israeli messaging app that was built in 2000, discontinued in 2002. But it was a message. No, I guess not an app, but a messaging tech, because this is before smartphones. And it sent out messages to Israelis and Jews to not go into work that day, to go into the 2 towers. It sent out a message 2 hours before the attack to tell people to clear that. So
okay, I haven't heard that. I've heard that more or less, I claim. And the thing is, I guess I can't say that it's not true, but I know, followed very closely a lot of people, are very critical of the U.S. government. and people I've come to trust, and none of them have ever mentioned that. So I've heard that kind of out there in the rumor mill or whatever. So I just can't confirm that.
Well, yeah, I mean, anybody can
Yeah.
look it up, Google, and make your own decision on it. It's
Right.
Odigo, Odigo.
Yeah, right.
Usually GPT is very sensitive when it comes to anything of accusing
Yeah.
anything. But when I was asking it about Odigo, it was very open and straightforward, and said, yeah, that it was the messages were sent out 2 hours before through Odigo. So,
Well, but even Mr. GPT,
yeah,
made
right.
mistakes.
I don't know.
I have heard things to that effect, and I just again, it's just that.
I need to know.
I haven't, researched it in depth because, of course, this was, better than 20 years ago. But back then, I remember doing a lot of research, listening to lots of podcasts, reading a lot of articles by people, again, who are very, very, very critical of the U.S. government and know that, and the Israelis. Yeah. I mean, these are not people that would hesitate to point the finger to the Israelis if there was any sort of
That's what
evidence.
The Israelis want you to
Yeah,
think.
well, but I do, so the thing is, just on that basis, though, I've tended to discount that. Now, I may be wrong. I mean, they're sometimes.
I just feel like everything I hear from our government just seems to be a lie. Right. So this is the problem that I don't want to become full Alex Jones, deep conspiracy theory. But you start telling me some of these things that have been proven in fact, and then I'm like, I don't know what to believe anymore.
Right.
It's like
it's not really a big step from saying, okay, they were aware of it and let it happen, to okay, they actually helped to bring it about. The fact that if they were aware of it, and it seems clear that they were,
why did they tell us?
Yeah, right. This Israeli moving company, but that should be. I mean, that fact right there should have just caused a huge rupture in U.S.-Israeli relations if we'd known about that. And if anything, it would probably make more sense to go bomb Israel than it would to be bomb Afghanistan or Iraq.
Right.
Right. I mean, seriously, it's just saying in the end, it was like the Taliban government didn't do anything to you. Certainly Iraq didn't do anything to you. But the Israelis knew about it and they let it happen. Yeah. You should be furious. You should have broken off relations, should have whatever. But it's like the USS Liberty, right? Again, they just decided to bury it. And it was more important I guess there's just such a fear of appearing to be an anti-Semite or whatever that we, again, it was more important than really the U.S. national interests or prestige or, the lives of 3,000 Americans.
Yeah, it's so, because like you said, so that's not really disputed then, the fact that the Israelis knew.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much documented. And
right. I mean, you won't find it in the mainstream, but it did leak out before it was,
they deep sixed it.
Right.
I tried to.
Yeah. So you can go back and find those videos, I know they're out there somewhere.
Yeah, I saw, even an interview of the 5 dancing Israelis when they were back in Israel on a Hebrew talk show, an Israeli talk show. And they said, yeah, we were there to document the event.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, whoa, so, what are we doing here? It's and
so again, I mean, I just haven't, so that's very solid evidence, of course, that they had foreknowledge of it and did nothing. I just haven't seen the evidence. I've heard rumors, or I haven't, let's say it hasn't come from what I would consider a truly reliable source. So I hesitate to say, okay, yeah, they were behind it, or they actually helped to facilitate it. But again, it's almost like it's not a very significant difference. It's just that if they knew it was going to happen and they did nothing, that makes them complicit in it.
Well, it's like us with the Moscow terror attack then, right? If we say that we knew about it, but we didn't give them a heads up. Right. But there's a lot of evidence that we probably were involved in some way, that it maybe got out of hand. I mean, just if it came from the Kiev regime, then by de facto, that means the West as well.
Yeah,
we're involved.
At least we knew about it.
We give them the equipment for the intelligence. At least
maybe we didn't draw up this plan. Maybe we didn't, and then we found out about it as it was happening. But that still makes us complicit,
right? And like there was when all the flights were grounded on 9/11. There was one flight, or maybe there was 2. Like I said, well, one flight full of Israelis that flew straight from New York, or I believe it was New York, but straight to Tel Aviv.
Right.
And it was a special only flight that was able to go,
Yeah.
and it's full of Israelis that got to leave
Yeah.
the day. It's
right. Yeah. No, I've heard that, and also Saudi Arabians were flown back too. I don't know exactly on what day, but.
So that's wild, right?
Yeah, I know
it's
it
crazy.
is. Right, exactly. So, I mean, if anything, if we're going to target two countries, it should have been Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Right.
But it's just something, this is the crazy thing about our foreign policy. It just doesn't really align with our real interests.
I'm becoming that guy that's starting to see Israeli Jewish conspiracies everywhere now. But the thing is, some of them, they're not really conspiracies. They're just, people want to tell you that they are, but the reality is that there's we will never know who it's
sometimes we just will never know for sure.
But there's a lot of fishy things. Okay, anyways, I just wanted to go down that. I don't want to go full conspiracy, but
I just put on the brakes right up to again. Yeah, they knew about it, and that's truly shocking. That would, and I think that's enough.
They knew about it. I feel like there's a little bit more.
Well. I just I'm not convinced that, or I don't yet believe, but I accept that it's within the realm of the policy. It's not a kooky idea based on things that have happened in the past.
I'm honestly afraid that Israel might do some type of terrorist attack in the United States and try to frame it and use it as an excuse that now we gotta beat the war drums and invade Iran. Something like that, or attack one of our bases. I'm more scared of Israel, our greatest ally, than any other country.
Oh yeah, I think with good reason. I mean, they're just nutty, and they have a lot of influence, and you should be scared of them.
And as they're being more and more exposed, I think they might act more and more reckless.
That seems to be the trend right now. I mean, they were, like I think we've said several times that. Like their seizure of Palestinian lands has been going on for decades. Maybe I just go give people an idea of the trend. I think I mentioned it was back in 1947 that Palestine was divided up. It was the UN partition plan, and it was supposed to be about roughly 50-50, which even back then wasn't fair because there were more Arabs, in Palestine than there were Jews. But as I said, there were immediately the Israeli militias launched their ethnic cleansing operation and drove a lot of the Arabs, not all of them, because we still have like a 20% of Israeli population's Arab, into what's now the West Bank and Gaza, and seized all the rest of the land. So they ended up they were supposed to get roughly 50%. They took 78%. And now so therefore the Arab Palestinians, they ended up with 22% of the land. Now they've actually just came to accept that over time. I mean, it's not fair, but even that wasn't enough for the Israelis. And since then, they've been taking more and more land. It's been incremental, just seizing pieces and acre by acre. And to the point where I don't know, it's down to 10% or something. You can see there are maps that'll show that. Like every 5 years, you just see like the amount of land that the Arabs still control shrinks and shrinks and shrinks.
It's probably not even 10% now.
Yeah,
It looks like it's in single digits.
Right. So anyway, it's just saying, but they did this incrementally, and now it's like they've sped everything up. Before it was incremental, and just like it would cause some protests in Europe, some from European governments, some protests from the U.S. government, but nothing was ever done. Now it's sped up. I guess they just have this, like we're saying, the sense of impunity, and they're just looks like they're going for all of it. I think that's what they're going to.
They're so nutty. I feel like they're the only. No other country could ever get away with this type of thing.
No.
It's crazy how they can get away with it, and I think part of the power is, if you question it and start talking about some of the things we talk about, just these events, these horrific events, atrocities that Israel committed against civilian population, committing acts of war just regularly over and over again. And if you start talking about it, you're an anti-Semite.
Right.
Like that's the thing that's frustrating, is I think they figured out how to use the language and the power of being called an anti-Semite. So people just say,
Yeah.
just don't talk about it. It's too complicated.
Right.
Just don't listen.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you
Just say it's complicated.
exactly. Exactly. I think that's, I would say like the fear of anti-Semitism is, led to, the current horror.
Mm.
And it's just paralyzed a lot of people that should know better.
Well,
We've talked about the Christian churches that are actually Christian Zionists, but then most of the mainstream churches have just, when they're quick to condemn atrocities anywhere around the world, most of them have been silent because, again, they're so afraid of being accused of anti-Semitism.
right.
So it's just that fear of anti-Semitism just has to end. You have to be able to criticize these people. And be fair in your criticism, and when there are exceptions, there are individual Jews that clearly are unconditionally anti-Zionist. Hey, they deserve praise and whatever, but it's a fact. Just like those individual Jews will tell you, it's a fact that the Israeli government, that the great majority of Jewish organizations are Zionist and have been using this weapon of anti-Semitism, or the fear of anti-Semitism to act with impunity, to do things that no other group in the world would be able to do.
Right. I mean, it has a huge muzzling effect on people.
Right.
I mean, even just me, I was just thinking, like, should I talk about this? That I have these thoughts? Like, is it okay? Because, we have such a small audience, but I'm thinking, like, how people view me. Is it dangerous? Will I be an anti-Semite? Like, this is silly.
Right.
I have an honest question.
Yeah. Right.
And I want to know. I shouldn't be
Right.
afraid to ask the
Right.
question.
Right.
And
Exactly. At this time when there's an actual genocide going on and people are still obsessing over anti-Semitism, I just find it obscene. It's just like, forget it. I don't care if you're an anti-Semite, whatever that means. Just this genocide's got to end. And this government that's out of control and trying to pull us into a war and whatever, it has to be, this beast has to be tamed,
Right.
and this spell of this word, with magical properties that have kept us silent, we just got to forget about it. I don't care. You can call me an anti-Semite, whatever. We have to speak the truth.
Right. Okay, well, I'll wear that anti-Semite badge proudly. That's the only way. Well, in the last podcast, we were talking about how much money Israel gets. And it was $3 billion a year. So
Right.
you're saying, I just saw the 8
package.
They got $26 billion.
Right. I wanted to bring that up. It's true. It's that it's $3 billion a year, but that's been going on forever. It's like for the last 20 years or something, or longer. Israel's that's just the baseline. That's what they get no matter what, just automatic funding, $3 billion a year, $3 billion a year. And as just a result of that, the Israel, has been by far the largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid. And the interesting, like, number 2 has been Egypt, but that's actually Israel, because what it is
buy off.
Yeah,
Egypt.
exactly. The Egyptian government is bought off. And that's why you see, like the Egyptian government cooperates with Israel at the Rafah crossing, essentially because they've been bribed and to do Israel's bidding on these security matters.
So gross.
So that's right. That's where all our foreign aid goes. It's been utterly distorted. It doesn't make any sense. If you're going to have foreign aid, that's like these little. Egypt could use it for real development, but not for, not as a payoff to
allow genocide to
right,
continue.
Exactly. So anyway, there's this baseline of the $3 billion, but then there are always things on top of that. If there's ever an excuse to give something to Israel, it's given. And then, as you pointed out most recently in this aid package, $26 billion.
It's crazy amount of money.
Right.
It should have people so furious. Like we passed this, I guess, $90 billion plus bill that none of the money is going to the U.S. It's going to $61 billion right to Ukraine, which is another, we've talked about this before. It's just a black hole. It's not going to make a bit of difference. And then $26 billion to Israel so they can continue their genocide. And, then some to Taiwan to antagonize.
Like $10 billion, I think, to Taiwan.
Right. So $10 billion Taiwan to antagonize China, basically. All these are terrible, terrible to play. Worst places to put your money.
Right.
Like, I'd much rather we just put it in a big pile in the White House lawn and burn it. That'd be 100 times better.
Right.
And then we do all of this, and then you see stuff happening here in the U.S. Like the Maui fires that,
Right.
my wife, one of her friends, lost their house and everything, and all their
Yeah.
cars there.
Right.
Um, and then I think the federal government gave everybody like $300.
Right.
That's it. Like,
Right.
why couldn't we use some of that money to help
Right.
when
Yeah.
there's a natural disaster
Right.
in our country? Or we have
Right.
this huge border crisis. We have a huge fentanyl problem. We have record homelessness, people dying on the streets. It's like, and then you just see this money being shoveled overseas for causes that the American population don't support.
Right.
The people don't support the Ukraine war. That's so how, and then we give all this money to Israel to carry out this horrible genocide.
Right.
And then we were just talking about it. Is a lot of that money that we're giving to Israel will go to replenish their munitions, but some of
Right.
it is going to go funnel back into the United States to continue buying our politicians.
Right.
It's such it keeps I know we just talked about it, but it just blows my mind that this is allowed to happen.
Right.
How do we
Yeah.
fix it?
Yeah. Well, I think, part of what we're saying is just that you have to this fear of, anti-Semitism we just have to drop it. We just have to be openly critical, and we have to point out, what's going on. And there's no other way. There is reason to be somewhat. It's awful what's happening. The passage of that bill is just a travesty of legislation there. But there is reason to be hopeful that finally, because again, they're not. Israel has just gone kind of ripped off its mask and started just stomping on Gaza like Godzilla. It's really hard to hide the reality. It was easier in the past. Like we've always known that like they've targeted UN facilities, people that watch closely. It's a pattern that stretches all the way back to Bernadotte in 1948 roughly. Stretches all the way back to that time and probably earlier. There probably were other incidents, other assassinations, but most people don't follow these events that closely. And, maybe they'll occasionally hear that some sort of a UN official was killed or a UN facility was bombed. And they just assume, well, it can't be that they targeted them. It's just like it was a mistake. It was collateral damage or whatever. And then people forget about
mistakes.
It. Right. But now it's just like it's happening so fast and on such a scale and day after day that people, even who weren't all that engaged, just can't help but see the pattern. And so, it's not enough, but there's, I sense that like the number of true Israel people who've had their eyes open about Israel has probably tripled, quadrupled, in just these last 6 months.
Yeah, well, they're also just so open about it, so openly racist and openly genocidal.
Right. No, but it's amazing, though. Like if you read the New York Times, you just don't get any of that. Well, it was just the other day that the New York Times, in some sort of piece on Israel, said that there had been scores of civilian casualties in Gaza. So at least 34,000 dead. That's not scores of, civilian casualties. So, there are a lot of people, I think probably more than you realize, that just rely on these kind of mainstream sources, and everything is being filtered. There was also something came out recently, I think it was from the Intercept, a memo, that was leaked by a New York Times reporter on what words reporters were allowed to use. They definitely couldn't use the word genocide, but they weren't even supposed to say what, like refugee camp, or, it was just a number of things. It was all, the language is being carefully censored, to remove any sort of real criticism of Israel. So, I do read these New York Times pieces, and they're just so mendacious, and, because what's going on. It's just a combination of, obfuscation, sometimes really weird sentences that, the point is always to exculpate the Israelis of any sort of, guilt. And
there's a lot of big words you use.
Okay,
what does mendacious mean?
they lie, you know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
right.
like the mentir to lie.
Yeah,
Okay, now I
yeah,
feel
okay.
a little
Right,
smarter.
right, right, right.
Okay.
Yeah, no, they just simply lie, or they either lie or they obfuscate. You know, what I mean, they just kind of have these long passive sentences where you just at the end, you know, you say, "Oh yeah, something happened" and whatever, but you don't know who's responsible.
Mm,
Same thing about Ukraine. I mean, they simply are, you know, conveying
right.
propaganda, you know, for the Ukraine's side and the Ukrainian side in Ukraine, and for the Israelis in Palestine. And the thing, what I was just saying, is that there are more people than you probably realize, who just rely on these kind of sources. They
It's funny
you
because
know,
they assume that these are the authoritative correct sources, and
right,
if you're watching anything else, that's the disinformation.
right,
You're
right,
getting stuff on Instagram or
right,
TikTok
right,
because if you're just on Instagram, TikTok, you can see footage of actual IDF soldiers that they post
right,
themselves
right,
celebrating them killing children.
right,
There was one that I saw the other day where an IDF soldier posted on Instagram saying that, my hobby is to sniff the shoes of the Palestinian children that I kill. I try to sniff at least 10 a day
right,
after I kill them.
right.
It's like how horrible is that? That's
Yeah,
just
right,
they just and they
right,
openly post these things. They
right.
celebrate. There's videos of them torturing people,
Yeah, yeah, no,
and so
right, exactly. And that's just being covered up. I mean, that's what you can say. It's just being covered up
right. But
by the
how
New
would
York
people
Times.
say that that's disinformation?
Right.
Well, I guess they
Well,
just don't even see it.
yeah, they don't see it. You know, they don't want to see it, probably, for a lot of them. And then they also sense, like, I think a lot of people don't think that clearly, but they let their fears kind of determine their thoughts. They know, like, well, if I say this is bad for my career, I could be accused of being an anti-Semite, or or believing in a conspiracy theory. And yeah, we just keep, that's dangerous stuff. This is the safe, approved stuff. This is the establishment, media, and then maybe to varying degrees they really believe in it. Who knows how much they really believe in it? But I think just some of them probably really, really do. They just
Mm,
they trust it, and this is a lot of people. Been grew up reading the New York Times. They've been reading it for the last 50, 60 years,
right.
and they just, for them, that's all the news that's fit to print, that's the authoritative news source. And one time it's always had its slant, and it's always had a slant on Israel. There's no question about it. But I think it used to be overall, a really good source of information, and a lot of real reporting was done in that. And it could, especially in the past, like in the 60s, the Pentagon Papers were published in the New York Times. This was very embarrassing for the government, right? So they could act against the interests of the the U.S. government, but they just don't now. I mean, they've become a mouthpiece of the deep state, of the government in general, and they just purvey this, the propaganda that comes from favored U.S. allies.
Mm,
But I think for a lot of people don't realize that, and the problem is that those people are often the people with power. It's the people in government who are in academia and so on. You would think, you would hope, these people would be intellectually curious, but you'll find that a lot of them really aren't. They just they stick with their safe sources of information.
yeah. They're just all of our institutions seem to be captured.
Yeah,
And they were
yeah,
and I'm just starting to realize that that you use the term that Israel got its tentacles deep into our system, and I think that's a good good imagery. That
uh-huh.
it really is, that they really have really gone deep into all of our institutions, not only in our political system, but
Yeah.
oh, it's scary. Well, I wanted to ask you a different question. You mentioned something earlier that made me think of something that my friend that was asking. So, Dom, if you're listening, this question's for you. Is what are the other Arab nations? What is their relationship with Israel? Because you mentioned that we give a lot of money to Egypt, but
Right.
to put people in power that are more compliant with Israeli
Right.
policies.
Right.
So what is the situation with these other Arab nations? We're talking, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, throughout the region. How do they view Israel right now? How do their governments view them, and how their populations view them? And do you see some type of powder keg there as well, where things
Right.
can start to change?
Okay, well, there are certain governments that are solidly anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian.
Hmm.
That would be Iran. I say that was like one of the almost founding principles of the Islamic State. When it was founded in 1979, following the revolution, and they have stuck to that. That's one reason. That's the main reason that Israel Netanyahu is just obsessed with Iran. Iran's a large, powerful country, and they are just have a principled, opposition to Zionism. And then another one is Syria. So these are both countries that have long been kind of in the crosshairs of the Israelis and then the neocons in the U.S. government.
So why, I mean, I can see Syria as the, borders Israel,
Yeah,
so
well,
I can see why, but Iran is pretty far away.
right. And it's just quite simply, I think mainly is to say, well, these are our brothers, our Muslim brothers. So
Are they? But
they're Shia, but there is still, the split between the Shia and Sunni. It's not, it's been healed to a great extent. I mean, I think there's always tensions there, frictions.
Were the tensions there kind of wedged by Israel and the United States?
Well,
To
yeah,
wedge issues between the Sunnis and the Shiites? Were they have much beef before? I'm sorry, I'm
yeah,
becoming that person that thinks that all conflict
yeah.
originates from
I think
Israel.
I think there's probably no question that they favored and worked to exacerbate the frictions, but you can take it too far. The thing about conspiracy theories that centered in the U.S. say, yeah, the U.S. has a lot of power. The U.S. can do a lot of mischief, and there are conspiracies, no question about it. But other peoples have agency, which means they're capable of making their own mistakes and having their own fights, and don't forget it. It's not They're not simply puppets. I think that like the friction between Sunni and Shia is real, and it's largely is organic. It's something that when Iran um, rose to power, I mean, just Saudi Arabia, saw saw Iran, as a rival, real danger to its dominant position in the region, and has worked out this anti-Shia coalition, or did. So we had, and it supported these terrorist groups like Al Qaeda that ended up killed a lot of Shia. We're aware of like the occasional Jew or Christian that gets killed, but probably for every one of those, like 100 Shia were killed, by these terrorists, these jihadi groups supported by Saudi Arabia. The hatred was real. I think the friction was real. It wasn't just an invention of,
It seems like a lot of people had beef with Iran with very little justification.
Yeah.
It sounds like the Iranians haven't really been doing anything actively to piss people off.
Right.
But
well, yeah, Iran's a country that that I've heard, going back, it used to be known as Persia, and the language still is really properly called Persian.
Farsi.
Some people say Farsi, but I think like most translators, interpreters refer to it as Persian. Well, for the last 400 years, they just don't have a record of invading other countries. They have not, for centuries.
I think the problem is too many people just watch 300 and just think about,
yeah. Well, I mean,
Spartans.
it's just that, there always have been these tensions between Shia and Sunni. I guess I don't know that much about it, but it's waxed and waned over the centuries. That's not something that artificial that the Israelis created or that the U.S. created. These frictions, these mutual suspicions and whatever. It's been there, but it comes and goes. It's not necessarily it's not they haven't always been in a state of war. The Sunni against the Shia, not by a long shot. But I think there's probably no question that when it flared up again after the Islamic Revolution, in Iran, that the CIA and Mossad and whatever did their best to add fuel to the fire, and they saw that was very much in their interest to keep Muslims pitted against each other.
But that's ending now.
Yeah, no, that's right. No, it was quite remarkable.
And
What was
China brokered that
right,
peace deal,
right,
right, between
right,
Saudi Arabia and Iran. That's
right.
huge.
That's
Israel's
huge.
got to be upset. Do you think that's
Yeah,
also
yeah.
playing into their calculation? Like we got to
Well,
try
I
to.
think it actually it's put them in a weaker position. I mean,
Mhm.
that's it's a real problem. I mean, they had. You know, there certainly are. I think we mentioned there must be factions within Saudi Arabia still are very anti-Iranian, but that's not what the what the government, the crown prince, has made this deal and has been sticking by it. The deal with the Iranians, and then when um, yeah, Israel was planning its attack on Iran. Yeah, Saudi Arabia and UAE, which used to be much friendlier with, well, very hostile to Iran, said you're not going to, none of your, or the U.S. cannot use any. I guess no, it was even before. It was actually the
Mhm.
retaliation from Iran. They told the U.S. that you cannot use
Right.
the bases that you have on our territory, and that's a real change,
Right. So
right?
even just our ability now, even if we did get dragged into a war
Right.
with Iran, our ability to logistically is gotten
Yeah.
a lot more difficult
Right.
because countries like
Right.
Saudi Arabia are not going to allow us to use their land to
Right.
launch attacks into Iran.
Right.
Um, okay, well let's go back. So the original question is: so Iran and Syria were the OGs in terms of like we we we
Solidly,
we stand with the Palestinians
right.
and their right to exist. Um,
Right. Well, Lebanon is a very complicated country because it's not. There are a lot of different ethnic groups there, and it's and the central government does not really have very firm control over the whole country. But all in all, there's very strong anti-Israel, anti-Zionist sentiment, anti-Israel sentiment in Lebanon, and that's thanks to Israel's periodic invasions and bombings, of Lebanon.
right. They
They're,
how
they're,
often do
they're,
they bomb Lebanon?
oh well, I think on a small scale, it's like a monthly event. It's just always something happens, but it seems like every few years there's some kind of incursion, and sometimes major ones. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's just that Israel used to have friends within Lebanon, but they really don't have them anymore. Not in any significant numbers.
So
So the population and the governments in general is very hostile to Israel. For
so the Lebanese are more hostile
yeah,
towards
right.
Israel.
And
They
then of
used to
course,
be a bit more.
yeah. Well, actually, what I understand is that Hezbollah, or those are the Shia in the southern part of Lebanon. They used to be actually favorably disposed to Israel
Mm,
up until 1982, when the first Lebanon invasion occurred, and then
they said, "Hey
it's just
guys, you
yeah,
invaded us."
yeah, right, right. So that changed everything, and that's how it really that gave rise to Hezbollah, a resistance organization. And yeah, so they're very, very strong, very um, dedicated to
Yeah, I
opposing
guess we can
Zionism.
almost kind of see just like, well, to see which countries are in cahoots with Israel and the United States are the ones that are not being bombed by Israel, right? Like Saudi
Right,
Arabia isn't, but
right,
Iran's been heavily sanctioned.
right,
Syria is being bombed constantly by
right, right.
us and Israel. Lebanon as well is getting bombed, but
Yeah,
countries like Egypt are not getting
right,
bombed
right,
because basically we paid off. We
yeah,
basically purchased that government.
right,
Didn't that happen in the what was it? The Arab Springs. There's Mubarak, right? The Egyptian was overthrown because
right,
he was a U.S. puppet, right?
right,
And
right.
then we installed somebody.
Well, they had elections, and it was the Muslim Brotherhood won, but he just didn't. That government didn't last very long.
Was
They
it why?
so
Was it overthrown by the Israelis? that's
well,
that's my number one question when anything goes wrong.
yeah. Well, I haven't heard that, but I'm sure they had a hand. But I think more likely, the U.S. But also, the old, from what I understand, who I forget the name of the Muslim Brotherhood leader that was elected president, but somebody described him as being, him and the other leaders in the Muslim Brotherhood, as being afraid of their own shadows, meaning they were very timid, and I don't think they rooted out any of the deep state, which was very strongly opposed to them, and so they just engineered a coup, got him rid of him. Now we have Sisi, who's just like like the Mubarak before him.
So that's somebody that basically was installed by the United States,
Well, I
Israel,
haven't.
or like
I'm sure they. I wouldn't at all be surprised. I would be. In fact, I would be surprised if they didn't play a role. But
this,
again, don't forget there are
right?
local forces.
But we this is
Right.
what we do. And we talked this
Right.
before is what the CIA does with the National Endowment for Democracy.
Yeah.
So we pump in billions of
Yeah.
dollars into the country to control their media, to control their narratives,
Yeah.
to support prop up certain
Yeah.
people,
Right.
and funnel money into opposition groups.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. No.
so
It's true. We've meddled in countries all around the world, varying degrees of success. We don't always have our way. It is again. It's not. Yeah, we find there already are these opposition forces. Not like we just simply create them, but we pump up certain ones and give them more power than they would have normally.
right. And it's funny
Right.
because we always are constantly accusing other countries of influencing
Yeah.
Russia, influencing our
Yeah.
elections, like people that are protesting,
Right.
pro-Palestinian protesters. We have politicians saying that these are, being paid by Putin.
It was Nancy Pelosi said that.
Yeah, and I've seen some
silly.
others as well.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, it's really silly.
And we're so involved in
Right.
contorting every other nation's internal politics.
Right. Yeah.
media.
Yeah. No, there's no self-reflection there. There's no attempted empathy, no humility. Just this kind of supreme vanity. Just in the end, well, what we do, it's okay. It's, because we're the good guys, It's just, we're blinded by our own halos.
And then another, I guess, country that's bordering that we should just talk about real quick is Jordan.
Right.
Jordan has been kind of a U.S. puppet for a long time.
U.S. and Israeli puppet. Yeah. No, I think that's
do you see things potentially changing in these countries? Like,
it's just, I think the king of Jordan is very nervous, because he knows that more than half of his population is Palestinian, and I think probably a good part of the remaining Arabs are also pro-Palestinian. So he's pursuing a policy that's not at all popular there. So there's no sign of major unrest, but it could happen. I mean, there's a potential for that. He of course cooperated in the the shoot down of the Iranian drones and so forth. His airspace was open, and I think actually the Jordanian army was supposedly shot down some drones themselves. But then afterwards, he really made every effort to kind of downplay their role.
Do you think if there's another Iranian attack, do you think Jordan would do that again, or do you think that he's this is?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. It just may be that they're looking at it and say, oh, things. Again, it's just like Israeli power seemed absolute almost. Backed by the United States, and that's why a lot of I'm sure governments like Jordan just made the bargain with the devil because the devil was all powerful, right. It seemed. But now, things have shifted because of, the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the growing strength of Iran, and then the decline of the United States. I mean, it's just the U.S., the unipolar moment has passed for the U.S. The U.S. is no longer the hyperpower, as it was called, like back in the 1990s and early 2000s. And I think people are seeing the rise of BRICS. It's just the balance of power of change is changing. And I'm sure governments all around the world are aware of that and are, adjusting accordingly. And I'm sure that the king of Jordan is aware of it. He may still just decide he has to stick with,
or maybe play a neutral role.
It's possible. I mean, again, it's just like there's already been a shift. The Saudi Arabia and like the United Arab Emirates were very solid allies of the U.S. and kind of covert allies of Israel. It's not like they've gone completely to the other side, but now they're playing kind of like Turkey or something. They kind of play both sides, but that's an important shift. They're not. They were firm allies, and they no longer are.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what do you think if war broke out between Israel and Iran? Will there be any Middle Eastern countries that will fight? No, none of them will fight with Israel, right? I think some of them may just will any of them allow Israel to use their, let's say, airspace or their bases or the United States? Or do you think that basically Israel is by itself if something happens, because there are a few
Yeah.
governments that are being paid off,
Right.
but the popular populations
Right.
aren't happy, so they have to walk
Yeah.
this tightrope.
Right.
It's like
They'd
I
be
can't
very-
just go straight and
right.
join up and
Right.
with Israel and start attacking Iran. There's going to be a revolution in my
Right.
in my city, or
Yeah.
my country.
Well, yeah. It's hard to say what kind of deals might be made, but I guess Israel and the U.S. realize that they just can't rely.
They don't have friends.
On these air bases. They can't rely on the certain airspaces that they had before, and it just makes military operations much more difficult for them. And might be one of the reasons why the U.S. was clearly just so terrified of a war between Israel and Iran. And they understood how bad it might go.
Right. They don't have any friends in the Middle East. It's just the
Right.
ones they paid off, but that's
Right.
not enough.
Right.
They can't rely on them.
Uh-huh.
Okay, we're getting close to an hour. Let me just ask one last question. Can we recap any further information on the Israeli strike in Iran?
Right.
Kind of what I saw, a headline in RT where the Iranian defense minister said that it was essentially nothing, that these were basically toys that our children fly. They were small mini quad drone copters that did really nothing.
Yeah.
Do we have any verify anything?
Well, what I saw, there is a satellite photo that shows some damage to a radar facility, but it doesn't appear to be major damage. Like maybe one of these drones, hit the corner of a radar facility or something like that. There's a hole, but it's the radar is still standing. That's the only damage that is at all documented.
I heard an airfield, but then there was satellite footage that showed that the airfield was undamaged.
Right.
And
so it seems like
they shot down that drone.
Right. So again, it seems like these drones, well, I think almost certainly they would have to be launched within Iranian territory, by MEK or some other anti-Iranian government terrorist group.
Does Israel not have drones that they could launch that would reach there? I mean, because the drones that Iran launched were real budget, cheap drones. They're slow, but why couldn't Israel do the same thing? It seems like you got these. We don't have the ability to produce these drones.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. It's just they do not seem to have actually a real major missile force. Because when they're discussing when prior to the Israeli attack, which whatever it was turned out to be, nobody discussed like missiles launched from the territory of Israel. Of course, Iran launched their drones and missiles from their own territory.
Right.
But it seems like Israel does not have a significant missile force. They built up this air defense, which apparently is quite good, partly because it's something built over a period of decades and is multi-layered and so on and so forth. But they don't seem to have a substantial missile force, so they have to fire it from aircraft, or from a submarine. Now, apparently, there's evidence that at least a couple of missiles were fired from an aircraft over Iraq, but like the boosters were found in the desert, but it was 100 miles or 100 kilometers from the Iranian border. And so that would be that the warhead was, the boosters already left. The warhead would have to travel 100 kilometers, just on its momentum. Mm-hmm. And that's not possible. So it's not even clear. It just seems to be sort of a pretend attack. Missiles fired in the direction of Iran. Maybe there's more to it than we know, but just nobody's coming up with any significant evidence. The most is that some damage to a radar facility. That's the only thing that's been documented.
So it does put Israel in a position where it looks kind of weak. Then.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But of course, we have a media that played up the Israeli non-attack and downplayed the Iranian,
real attack.
Real. So there will be a lot of people, and maybe even people in some of these foreign country, Arab countries that are going to believe something different from what's real. There are a lot of people again who just trust that the mainstream media. But that the experts, like the actual military experts in these different countries and so on, know what happened, and they got to be telling their, their leaders, what the truth is, and
Mm.
that's going to affect, again, policy down the road, I'm sure.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think we'll stop there. So yeah, anybody listening, look up the five dancing Israelis. There's more of the 9/11 story that my dad wants to tell you, and the Odigo messaging system as well. It's go down the rabbit hole. Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Dad.
All right.